Story 1. The Talking Pig. I currently live in the center of Aguascalientes. I've been here for several years. But before I moved here at the age of 22, when I got a good job and preferred to move to the city, my parents didn't want to. They loved life over there. Years later, they also moved, but when I was 18, I worked with a man, carrying and bringing cattle. Something happened to me that stayed with me for several years after that. My work started very early. At 5 in the morning I was already with Don Chema, a man I love a lot and who taught me a lot of things. When I finished working with him, I went to my house and rested for a while. I wanted to earn enough to be able to move to the city as soon as possible. That's why Don Chema offered me to work on the animals' food at night. Not so late, but it was an extra job. It was only 2 hours. It started at 7 and ended at 9 at night. On one of those occasions, I walked to a small house that Don Chema had, on the banks of Tapias Viejas, a very small town that is where I lived, passing General Ignacio. To that little house, Don Chema let me in without a problem. The first few days he did accompany me. He taught me what I should do, that it was not so difficult, the truth. And then, as I already had a lot of confidence and I always did my job well, he simply gave me the keys to go alone and he gave them to me in the morning that I saw him. I remember that night it had barely gotten dark. I arrived at that little house, a small construction, with a single window, shelves with the containers that held the food for the pigs, the cows. I think they were more vitamins and things like that. And apart from all this, it had a small corral, with about 4 pigs. I was standing at the door, about to put the keys in when I heard that there were several adults talking inside the house. I couldn't mistake the place because, I tell you, this was on the edge of the town. There was not a single construction apart from this for many meters. I was already on the highway. And I did worry because Don Chema had never mentioned to me that someone else could enter. In fact, he always told me to close well, and although over there, in that year, 98, it was not common to know that someone would rob in the town. No, it was a quiet place. So I open the door, I enter quickly, I turn on the light, I stop hearing those voices and I turn to the left, which was where I heard them more or less, to what I only saw the pigs, watching me, still. I stay watching them and they, after a few seconds, stop seeing me and walk, they settle down and lie down. I looked everywhere, checking the only window I had, and no, it was very well closed. It had a barred protection, too, and outside that door you couldn't enter anywhere. I get out of there, I close with a lock, I turn around to that little house looking for someone, those people I had heard talking to. I had heard them inside and I really didn't understand anything. There were several, I was sure of that, but I wanted to confirm that they weren't out yet. When I don't see anything else, I run to Don Chema's house to tell him what had happened. When he opened the door, I told him that I had heard people talking inside the corral, but that I didn't see anyone. And I told him this in case something was missing, not to think that it had been me. He closes the door of his house and asks me to walk. I walk with him, not to the corral, but to my house, and I remember very well what he told me. Cesar, I was very worried that you would come to see something like that. Look, in the corral it has always been quiet, but last week Fermin brought me a pig from out there by the locote. And I'm sure that's the one who's doing all that. I thought I had imagined it, I'm not going to lie to you. Because even 2 days ago, you see that you couldn't come because of your mom. It was me, and being there, I heard very clearly, Cesar, how several people were talking behind me. Like you, I didn't understand anything. But I turned around and... It's that pig they brought me. That's the one who's... I don't know if he's making the others talk or what, but it's that one. You would have seen the way he was looking at me. A Nawal no S, that's for sure. That's something else. When I heard Don Chema and remembered how those pigs were watching me, I was so terrified, but at the same time I was grateful not to have known that at that moment. Don Chema told me that it was better if it wasn't anymore, that he would wait for me, that they were going to take him in 2 days, and I took his word. He apologized to me, telling me that he didn't expect that to be real, that he wanted to believe that it was his imagination, but I confirmed it to him, without knowing it in advance. That animal, as Don Chema said, was taken away 2 days later. I don't know where. Someone went for him. Don Chema didn't know why they had taken him away, if they didn't let him sell it. Like they just wanted him to be taken care of for a week, and he asked me not to say anything. He didn't understand what had happened, and he didn't want to be made a bad reputation, when he was also scared. I continued working with him on everything, remembering this experience with him from time to time, and relieved that we never again heard a pig or an animal talking in that village. Sometimes we forget that there are things or dark practices that perhaps lead to animals or what they seem to be, to do things that they should not do, and that these are not by far naguales, but something different. But what would they be? Story 2. The man with the horns. It was a very short period that I remember having lived in Tamaulipas. What I want to tell you about that time is something that not many comment on. Some think that a certain degree of insecurity was given until 2008, more or less in advance. The truth is that no. There have always been hot zones around here, as we tell them, territories where there were usually encounters between these groups that are dedicated to ugly businesses. And what I want to tell you doesn't have to do with these groups, directly at least, but it's something that I would like to bring up. I mention the issue of dates more than anything because when I lived over there, with my parents and my grandparents, in a little town that is apart, over there on the road, Ciudad Victoria, Hidalgo, called El Barretal, I think it's still called that. In the present, compared to before, it is a town somewhat uninhabited. At that time, in the year 95 at most, we still lived there. I remember having been there for about 10, 12 years. I was perfectly conscious, I remember everything well. We lived on the side of a street where, just on the avenue, there was or was, I don't know currently, a volcano and an automotive workshop. You gave everything to the bottom, which were just a few streets. They finished the houses and the rest back. It was pure mountain, nothing else. Trees, dirt, weeds. And just in the afternoon, almost night, my cousin and I were playing over there, in the mountain. We liked to bring sticks with different shapes and put them together in my grandparents' yard to make a kind of house, a fortress, we used to call it. That's what we used to do when we heard a whistle. My cousin and I turned at the same time, to the side where there was a pure mountain, and we saw a man, or rather his silhouette, and I think we could only see that because it really looked very dark where he was, or rather from where he was walking towards us. My cousin and I could still illuminate the light of my grandparents' patio, little, but we could see. This man that we were observing was wearing a charro-like hat, and even seeing him he kept making that noise at us, whistling at us. My cousin and I ran, jumping between the weeds, the holes in the ground, and we arrived shouting to my grandfather. Clearly, that man was not coming with good intentions. And before we got to the patio door, my grandfather started shouting a lot of curses at that man. That he went to who knows where, that he didn't belong there, that we were just children, that he knew who he was looking for. While we were looking out the window, that man stopped a few meters from the patio. The pure silhouette, even now, with the light of my grandparents' house. My grandfather kept telling him things, walking towards him, and he simply returned to the mountain, but now walking fast. My grandfather came in very angry, telling us that what we were doing there in the mountain at that time. And we told him that we did the usual, bringing the branches for our fortress and all that. That man, the one with the hat, had made fun of us, going out of the blue and scared us. What a dirty hat, huercos. What that bastard had in his head were horns. Didn't you see? Telling us this, my grandfather, with rudeness too. My cousin was the one who hugged my grandmother even more. My grandfather told us so sure, So serious, angry. He looked scared, of course. And my grandmother told him to calm down, that we probably didn't see him like that. But the important thing was that we were fine, that it had already happened. My grandfather closed the door and he was never a bad person. We knew him very well. I understood then that the one who was so angry was not in vain. And a little later, things were calmer. I was the only one to talk to him. I was sitting outside in a dining room and I came asking him what had happened. My grandfather apologized to me. He gave me a soda that he had bought me, and another for my cousin. The more I saw him, the more he gave it to him. And he told me that, as there were a lot of very bad people there, he had already heard several times that the guns were being fired on the highway, those people chasing each other. And my grandfather said that's why all the bad things stayed there in the town. And the devil was something of that stayed. That's why we shouldn't walk alone at night, much less in the mountain. Just a few months after that night, all in the family went to Nuevo Leon, to Allende, and we didn't visit that town again. Story 3. The Faceless Woman. I am from a little town in the north of Colombia, or as it is known to the north of Santander, in Santiago. A little town that was more than anything a place that is on the Santiago-Salazar Road. A large part of my family still lives there, and I visit them frequently. It was in one of those conversations that my aunt told us, already being old, sharing, horror stories with the family. The time when we were outside my grandmother's house. I was about 14 years old at that time. And in fact, until he told it again, it was that I remembered everything in detail. It was something that I had in mind, but that the coming and going of the city, the change in my life completely, made me forget about it. At that time we were outside, sitting, talking to my cousins, my aunts, my grandmother, may she rest in peace, when a neighbor arrived. We did know this man, but we didn't talk to him much. We knew he was a serious, calm person, who did take from time to time without being one of those drunk people and who were doing bad things. I mention this detail because we thought he was drunk when he arrived, coming down the hill that we had on 2 streets from us, running, telling us scared that a woman up there in the hill, that the woman without a face, that she was coming and I don't know what. We, the little ones, were scared too, and my aunt started to complain, telling him not to come to scare us, that he was sure drunk, that he was going to his house, and, behind him, he was walking hurriedly, but not running. Another neighbor came, with whom we did have a good relationship. He arrived, trying to calm this neighbor, telling him that nothing was happening, that he had stayed there, that he would not go down. My aunt, who was always the one who watched over us, changed her attitude, to now ask this neighbor, who also came from the hill, what was going on. This neighbor with everyone there, helping the other man to sit on a fence that we had outside the house, told him and we all listened, very seriously, that he and the other man were coming down from bringing firewood for the house. It was the 90s, beginning, so for some families it was regular that they used firewood for various things like cooking. That they were coming together from there, chatting. It was barely getting dark and that the two heard footsteps. They looked into the weeds between the trees because those footsteps sounded like those of a person before those of an animal, and that it was the other man who saw that woman first. He shouted at the other neighbor. He turned and said that he also saw her. And when the other man ran towards the town again, telling him not to stay there and that he should run too. This man managed to see that woman well, and he did say that she was a woman without clothes stuck between the trees and that her face was as if it was erased, blurred. She didn't have one and he also ran. He says he was more confused than scared, as if stunned by that. For that reason he didn't come running, once already in town. Because he said he didn't believe what they had seen over there. That it was a real, horrible and very strange vision. The weeks passed. That night, they had each gone to their house, first accompanying their neighbor, who had arrived more scared, running to his house, and then the other neighbor said he would go to his. My grandmother, time after time, told us that the neighbor, who had arrived confused, walking a little more calmly, from the next day of that, he could no longer get up from bed, he did not go to work either, and he already had several days like that. And my grandmother told us, because she had gone to see him, that the Lord's wife told him that at night he said he saw that woman in the window, standing, looking at him. And he kept saying that he was going to let her in, but no one else could see her. The other man who arrived scared that night did have a good scare, but we kept seeing him in the street as if nothing. However, the other neighbor, after a while we didn't see him again, he died. And no one knew well what of. Only one morning, he no longer woke up in his bed. Story 4. The woman in the rain. It was precisely in August 2011 that this happened to me that I want to tell you today. It is a date that I will never forget because something paranormal has never happened to me, except for what brought me to tell you this. For me, it was a custom to visit my grandparents. They lived in a little town called Mezquites, south of Huacatlan. And although it was not even far away the first times I visited them, since as a child we went very often there, but when this happened, I was already 21 years old, I had my own car and I was alone, I didn't need to be taken. So when I went with them, I spent the night there and I returned there being day. That's why I was surprised that in that August that I arrived with them, a little irresponsible on my part, driving down the road in the rain, not so strong, but we know that you should never trust that. But hey, I got there well. And what I tell you that surprised me was the fact that when the day of living with them passed, talking to them about my work, getting in touch, preparing dinner, everything. My grandmother, when it comes to the issue of the rain was falling very strongly, making wind and the rest. She told me, turning to see my grandfather, that, whatever I heard, I shouldn't look out the window. My grandparents were never one to joke about anything. They did have a pretty relaxed sense of humor, but they told me this differently. Seriously. I asked them if there was anyone out there, I don't know, a neighbor who was having problems or something. Believing that they were referring to something like that. However, they replied that no, that I just shouldn't open the curtains or the window, if I suddenly heard noises, that it would surely be the rain, the trees blowing, making sound, and that could be that the water entered or something like that. So well, I took it that way. That night, lying in a separate room they had for me. The rain was really a lot, more than a while ago. It didn't make that much air anymore, but that's why it didn't explain to me how outside, almost as if they were in front of the house. I heard laments. I can swear I was listening to a person, a woman, complaining right on the street, which made me wonder because it was raining too much and it didn't seem to be walking or passing. They were the laments of those that easily sounded like when, precisely, as my grandmother said, the air blows with the trees, with the windows, but no, it really couldn't be because there was almost no wind anymore. I got up, walked to the window, took the curtain and went there. When I was near the glass that I heard my grandparents. I had them by my side. The walls weren't that thick, and the ceiling was a bit thick. They had a space that connected to my room. So I could hear them perfectly. I could hear my grandma whispering to my grandpa that she was there again, that she wasn't leaving. And I could hear my grandpa tell her not to be scared, that they wouldn't lose sight of her, and that she wouldn't come near. I didn't understand who they were referring to, so with those comments I deduced that they were referring to a neighbor, who surely took advantage of the nights like that to go doing evil, rob, I don't know. And well, after hearing them say that, I just heard them murmur things that I no longer understood, and maybe they wanted me not to open the window so that that person wouldn't see me and realize it. And so I went to bed. The rain decreased after a while, and I kept hearing that voice outside, making those sounds. The next morning, I asked my grandmother what had happened. I told them that I had heard them, and they turned to look at each other. After a few seconds in silence, my grandmother told me that that didn't happen before, when we were children, but that it began to happen just a few years ago at that time, but that when it rained like that, it was not so bad. They thought it was a neighbor from out there, who would stop in the rain, crying, always in front of the house. The first time they heard her, they did confuse her with the sound of the wind. What I told them, however, until they looked out for the first time, they saw that it was a woman and not the wind. They could never distinguish any feature, know who she was, and it was until on one occasion that it was not raining so hard that they saw that that woman was not standing, she didn't even have legs, she was floating. Always in front of his house. My grandparents took the fright of their lives, and it's not that they got used to it, but my grandfather was the one who always reminded my grandmother that they shouldn't let them win, that if they lost sight of her, she was sure to get into their house, that no matter what, she couldn't win them, no matter how afraid they were. My grandmother told me that it always cost them a lot to stay watching the window when this woman appeared with the rain. That my grandmother cried from fear, that she prayed while she saw her, and they never backed down. They didn't know what she wanted, what she was going to, but they didn't let her get close either. And that was confirmed by my grandfather because he told me that one night, when he decided to ignore her, after having seen her through the window, moments after she looked back, that woman was closer, always floating. That's why they never took her away, since if it wasn't worth praying for them to know, it was worth not stopping to see her. That's why I also understood that the time I saw them, they looked more tired, exhausted. Sometime later, my grandparents, after the insistence of my uncles and my parents, accepted to move to another property that my grandfather had. It was not life for them to be like this. Nobody understood what was going on. They didn't believe them at all, although they did help them, but I who was there, seeing them, listening to them scared, with dark circles under their eyes both without resting, listening to those laments outside in the rain. I know that something bad was always waiting for them to stop looking out the window. For what? I do not know. I'm glad they never proved it. Story 5. The exorcist priest. I still live in a small town, leaving Queretaro, passing Montparnasse. I have my job in the city, but I like it a lot here. And the reason why I don't want to mention my name and the name of the town, that there aren't many for this area, it's because a lot of people from here are very religious. I have nothing against that, but it's more than anything that I don't know if when this happened that I'm going to tell you. That must have been the cause of what happened. This was very strange. Strange things happened. And look, in this town, about 20 years ago or a little more, there was a man who had a canteen. He was the only one in the town, and we are going to tell Don Francisco, the man, not to mention his name. He, during the nights, had that business, a canteen, and lived in the back, since his property, those lands were long. But in the day, in the mornings rather, it was very frequent to see people arriving, families with one of their members either asleep, carrying them, whether they were adolescents, children, or adults. Sometimes they took them covered from the face with some towel, some rag. And on other occasions, as I happened to see, that I saw that once I was going to my work, at about 6 in the morning, that I saw that outside my house there were people who helped me to do things, from the house of Don Francisco, through an entrance that was somewhat removed from his canteen. He was passing by a lady who was carrying a boy, covered in a garment, and this boy was screaming with a very strange, very torn voice, as if he had been very sick of the throat. They were holding him because he was waving, very barely walking, as if against his will, and they went to his house. By that point I had already heard from those families that they were going to see him. He was not discreet, but no one asked him anything. Except for some neighbors that I did hear, because Dad told me that they told him that they asked him at night, being in his canteen, that here was the people in the mornings with him. That Don Francisco laughed and that he told them that it was a madhouse and there he attended them. You know, that word that was used before to refer to a psychiatrist. However, no one believed him. They knew that Don Francisco had only studied until high school, so they all knew, judging some little things, that suddenly they saw him out there carrying the Lord, not in the canteen, but carrying with him in the wrist, for example, religious objects. They knew that Don Francisco, in the back of the canteen, in the mornings, was doing exorcisms. And this knowing was a saying. Nobody was clear about it, but I remember that one morning, a neighbor went to our house to tell us, very nervous, that they had taken Don Francisco. My parents left. I was just waking up to go to work, and this woman said that a black truck with people dressed as priests had come down and they took him out of his house, taking him by force, very early in the morning. This, which at first some people thought was a rumor, something that the neighbor had seen wrong or had been made up in plain sight, was confirmed. When that same night, Don Francisco did not open the canteen. Then it remained closed the following night, a week, a month, 2, and no one knew what had happened to him. After about 6 months, they demolished the canteen, their house, and it didn't happen like other times when they left the debris there. No, a truck came to take absolutely everything demolished. They didn't even let people get close. The canteen and Don Francisco disappeared. To this day, that terrain remains that. A vacant lot. That's it. It never returned. There are things in towns that we can't even imagine happening. A lot of people keep these stories to themselves. They don't tell them beyond those lands, many because they think they won't be believed.